Welcome to today's daily word. We'll be in Mark chapter 9, verses 2 to 8. Mark 9, 2 to 8, and there are four elements I want you to see here of this story. The metamorphosis, the men, the motion, and the message. And we'll start with the metamorphosis, because it's first. But before we do that, let me just pause for a moment and ask the question, why the transfiguration? What's the nature and function of the transfiguration here of Jesus on the mountain? Why here in the text? Why here in the narrative of Mark? What role does this story play? Well, I think principally it's meant to drive into the minds of the disciples the fact that death comes before glory, that the cross precedes glory. Think back to chapter 8 of Mark, where Jesus begins to talk about his coming death to the disciples, and Peter doesn't want it. It conflicts with his vision of the coming kingdom, so Peter takes Jesus aside and begins to, if you can imagine, rebuke him. Well, that earns him a counter rebuke, and Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan." Later in the chapter, Jesus talks about how if you want to be his disciple, you have to deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow him. Well, that's heavy business. That's not what the disciples were expecting. They wanted the glory. They didn't want the cross. But the cross has to precede the glory. And Jesus knew that they needed something that could power them through the tough times to come. It wasn't just enough to have faith. In fact, they needed sight. And sight is exactly what they get here in this story. So let's look at the metamorphosis in verses 2 and 3. Jesus is up on the mountain, some mountain, don't know exactly which one, with Peter, James, and John. And it says he was transfigured before them. And the idea of a transfigured in the original Greek is an external transformation. And it really, from that word in the Greek, we get our word metamorphosis. And so Jesus is somehow transfigured before him. There's a metamorphosis in him where his divine glory somehow bursts through and becomes visible. It's like God pulled back the veil, and all that divinity that was sort of concealed in the humanity, that glory just explodes forth in a visible, shining kind of way. And the side effect is that Jesus' clothes become so white that it was beyond the ability of any human to make the clothes that white. They're dazzlingly brilliant. Now, moving into verse 4, we encounter the men. We move from the metamorphosis to the men. Well, who are the men? Elijah and Moses, two great Old Testament saints. Moses, the great lawgiver, and Elijah, the great law defender. And here are these two Old Testament saints talking with Jesus. Now you may wonder, what are they talking about? Well, Mark doesn't tell us, but Luke 9:31 says they were talking about Jesus' coming death. Why were they talking about his coming death? To affirm that it was God's plan. To affirm, and the disciples could hear this, to affirm that Jesus' words were right. The cross must precede the glory. Death must precede glory. And these Old Testament saints, these venerable saints, validated the words of Jesus by affirming, oh yes, a death was coming. It was necessary for the Son to suffer. That's what they were affirming. Well, beginning in verse 5, we move from the men now to the motion. And by motion, I don't mean movement or activity. I mean motion in the sense of a courtroom, like where you make a proposal, a recommendation, a suggestion. Peter makes a motion. he doesn't know what to say, so he blurts out, "Oh, let's build 3 tabernacles." And it seems like Peter's saying, "Hey, let's make this thing permanent. Elijah's here, Moses is here, Jesus is here. Let's not lose the moment. Let's make this baby permanent." And it may be that in Peter's mind, with the arrival of Moses and Elijah, he was saying, if we make this permanent, maybe we can just inaugurate the kingdom right now. We can just skip that whole part about death and a cross and suffering, and we'll just usher in the kingdom now. Well, of course, that's not going to happen, because that was never God's plan. Verse 7, a cloud appears, and God's voice thunders out from heaven. But what does he say? Well, here's the last element of our story, the message. And here's what God says. Jesus is my son, and Peter, you better listen to him. In fact, you all have to listen to him, but especially Peter. Now, listen to him. What's the idea of listening to him? Well, I think it means you need to trust that when the Son says death and cross and suffering are necessary, you need to believe that really is the plan. If it conflicts with your view of the world, you better stick with Jesus' story. Listen to him, accept what he says. And isn't that good news for us as Christians? For a world of sinners? That there must be a cross so that the Son can die and bear the wrath of God to redeem sinners. If there was no cross, there would be no salvation for the likes of us. So praise God that there really was a necessary cross.